Welcome to Voices in Leadership, live streamed worldwide from the Leadership Studio at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I'm Dean Michelle Williams. The goal of Voices is to highlight the experiences of leaders confronting major public health frontiers and to better understand effective leadership and how it can affect change. I hope you find this program engaging and informative. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon and welcome to our audience here in the studio and to our viewers online around the globe. I'm Eric Anderson, the Director of Voices in Leadership. This series focuses on the lessons of effective leadership to create positive change in public health. This event takes place in the Leadership Studio, where the programs and related content have received over 4 million views to date and counting. Today, we host a discussion on leading by preparing for a changing world with Professor Gina McCarthy and Governor Jack Markell. Jack Markell served 2 terms as Delaware's governor, completing his tenure in 2017. During his time in office, Delaware's job growth was the best in the region and one of the best in the country. The state also reduced dirty air emissions faster than any other state, serving as a national model for improving the environment through efforts that also boost the economy. Under his leadership, Delaware won the top spot in President Obama's Race to the Top competition, and high school graduation rates saw some of the best increases in the country. Markell served as chair of both the National Governors Association and the Democratic Governors Association, and as president of the Council of State Governments. He also served for 10 years as Delaware State Treasurer. Before I turn this discussion over to our moderator, Professor Gina McCarthy, please join me as we welcome Jack Markell to the Voices in Leadership series at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Thank you.
Governor Markell, it's great to have you here, and I'm honored to spend a little bit more time with you. It's great. It's awesome. So I wanted to start not by talking about a routine thing, but I know you came here to make a big announcement. We had Governor Inslee, Governor Hickenlooper. Go for it.
Well, I do have a big announcement. I had so much respect for you when we worked together when you were head of the EPA that I am the charter member of the Gina McCarthy for President.
There you go.
There you go.
That's not exactly what I had in mind, but it's a
go.
good answer. Good answer. Damn, I can never get you, can I? Governor, I don't know if everybody knows this, but you know, you really came from a business background, and I found it really interesting as Governor of Delaware, and prior to that as Treasurer, you really made the transition into political life more smoothly than most do. You understood the societal issues you needed to deal with, and you had this sort of idea that every governor shouldn't just manage a state, but should do it in the context of a changing world. What do you mean by that?
Well, I do think it's very important that everybody who's in an executive leadership position in government have a very clear view of how the world around us is changing and what those changes mean for the people we serve and what we need to do differently as a result. And for me, I mean, there are just 2 massive forces at work on our economy. One, globalization, which means employers can hire from all over the world. And the other is automation, which means, you know, more and more jobs are being affected by the fact that, that computers and software can do things that people used to have to do. And those are incredibly important factors that have really huge consequences for all of the people of my state, all the people throughout the country. And I felt it was very important to have a perspective and to use that perspective in making decisions when I governed. And also, by the way, to communicate that perspective to the people I served. And I think what I found is people may disagree from time to time, or frankly often, with decisions that I made. But if I explained myself to them and I said I was making these decisions because of these changes going on in the world economy, they would at least give me the benefit of the doubt. And so in my case, it was really about investing massively in skills and also trying to connect more effectively with the world around us.
Well, you know, I'm interested in pursuing that a little bit more because I know that most people feel like that's the purview of the federal government to think about big things in the world, but lots can happen at state levels to actually build a foundation for a stronger economy.
I don't think too many people think that people at the federal level are thinking big thoughts about the world these days.
All right.
But maybe it's their purview. But you will find probably 50 governors of both parties or any independents say that we are not going to wait for the federal government to act on virtually anything that we do, and that we have to seize the opportunities ourselves.
Well, I mean, one of the things that you sort of made it a hallmark of what you did, not just in Delaware, but when you were chair of NGA, was to look at sort of the societal needs that we were facing, issues that are really important to the Harvard School of Public Health, in a way that you looked at them as real economic opportunities to address needs of individuals in a way that would address the societal problem, but also grow jobs and get people active. And I'm thinking of three things in particular. You had a big focus on unintended pregnancies, and you challenged the healthcare sector to think differently about it and to act differently, and you're still active in that area. And then you did work on criminal justice reform, which has attracted a lot of interest. And the third thing was, what was it?
Employment of people
Yeah,
with disabilities,
actually, yeah, the work you did with NGA.
Yeah.
On employment of people with disabilities. Those are three things that as a governor you saw as really important opportunities, but as a business person you also saw it the same way.
Right.
Explain to me why those three things, and give me a little bit more insight
Sure.
into how you're pushing the healthcare sector.
Yeah, okay.
In a nasty way. No, in a good way.
And there were others, but I think these three are all very interesting. So let me start with the issue of the unintended pregnancy.
Yeah.
So the rate of unintended pregnancy in our country is about 50%. Now think about that for a second. And this is not an issue I ever really thought about before. But when I came to realize that what so often happens when a woman delivers a baby as a result of a pregnancy that was not intended at the time of conception, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes she has to drop out of school or drop out of the workforce. Sometimes the father may have to drop out of school, and oftentimes it's a difficult start for the baby. Sometimes so difficult it's really challenging to get back on track. And so, for me, when I thought about that, and it was really brought to my attention by Mark Edwards, who runs an organization called Upstream USA. He used to run Opportunity Nation.
Yeah.
Fantastic guy, and he came to see me and he said, he had worked, as I did as governor, but he had worked on every issue from early childhood education to criminal justice reform to vocational education and everything in between. And he had come to the conclusion that the most important thing we could do to help all people achieve their potential was really to empower women to have their babies when they were ready for them. And so what happens, the typical woman, I know this is not a conversation people ever expect me to be leading.
I was going to say, you're not really the voice for typical women, but it's okay, continue.
No, I'm not. But the typical, if a woman is on the pill for 10 years, she has a 61% chance of getting pregnant because of a lack of compliance. And it turns out that there are more effective methods. And this is, favored by the American Council of Gynecologists, by the CDC, and that's the long-acting reversible contraceptives, the implant and the IUD. And the more I learned about this, I said, we have got to do something in Delaware to reduce the rate of unintended pregnancy, because this is one of the best opportunities we will have to help all people actually achieve their potential and to go as far as they want to go. And so we really, when you talk about challenging the healthcare system, we changed the healthcare system over the last several years so that when a woman of childbearing age has an interaction with the healthcare system, she is now asked whether she intends to get pregnant in the next year. And if the answer is yes, then she's connected with the appropriate preconception and prenatal care. And if the answer is no, she's made aware of the full range of methods. And we have trained our health providers throughout the state, not only how to place these devices, but we've trained the coders, the billers, the schedulers in the office. We've changed policies. It used to be a very good time to ask a woman whether she intends to have a baby in the next year is when she's in the hospital delivering a baby. And oftentimes she would like to wait for purposes of birth spacing and other purposes. But historically, if she has said, no, I don't want to have a baby next year, she's been told that she has to come back in 2 or 4 or 6 weeks.
Having had 3 children, that was the last question I was thinking about the next day.
I'm sure.
That's a good point.
But what's happened is because they're told to come back in 2 or 4 or 6 weeks, oftentimes they don't come back because they're so overwhelmed. Yeah. And they end up pregnant instead. And the reason that they were told to come back in 2 or 4 or 6 weeks is because the reimbursement policies did not allow the physician or the hospital to be reimbursed for a postpartum placement of a long-acting reversible contraceptive. So we changed that policy, and so what we've seen is a huge increase in postpartum placements. And so literally within the first 3 years, we've seen a 24% reduction in unintended pregnancy. I mean, it's massive compared to a 3% reduction across the country at the same time. We're seeing a similar decrease in abortion, and we expect that to continue to increase. So it's really it's been an amazing thing to see. And what's really exciting, they talk a lot about states being the laboratories of democracy. Yeah. So now Washington State has committed to do this. It's happening right here in Massachusetts, and it's happening in North Carolina. Those are the next 3 states. And so, it's when something is working well in a state, other states will follow.
So how did you come to focus on this issue? I mean, it couldn't have just been one conversation. And how did you ever roll this out? How did I find, because part of the challenge that we have is not to just identify, where the hang-ups are, but how did this turn into an opportunity for you?
Yeah. So to me, because there are really 3 big benefits here. One is the opportunity benefit that I talked about. The other is birth outcome, because if a woman has a baby as a result of unintended pregnancy, it's less likely she's doing the appropriate, taking the appropriate prenatal care. And then there's also some savings down the road. I mean, every Medicaid birth, a healthy Medicaid birth in Delaware is about $12,000, and we know a lot of these births are not healthy, so much more expensive. But for me, the real hook was around opportunity. That's why I ran for office in the first place. I mean, I think it's why most people run. I mean, the reason that you seek public office is because you want to do everything you can to help more people go as far as they possibly can. And when I started to understand the linkages between this issue and opportunity, it really got me hooked. And so we brought in Upstream, which is based right here in Boston as well as in Oakland, California. And they are really expert about how to put the training together. We put together a public-facing awareness campaign. And so they were incredibly helpful. And then the question was, well, how are we going to roll this out? And I was concerned about pushback, but I decided that I was actually going to talk about this in my State of the State speech, which is the biggest opportunity that any governor has to talk about something that's important to them. And so I have to admit, only 50% of the reason was for the sheer joy of watching the legislators want to slide under their seats as I talked about IUDs and implants from the governor's podium.
That's a lot of young women to speak to,
yeah.
I'm sure.
But we brought together all the stakeholders, all the healthcare providers and others, and it really went extremely well because people understood the connections between this issue, and we were very fortunate to have such a supportive group of players within our state.
How'd you get the healthcare sector to buy in?
They get it. I mean, they just get it, and they really understand all of these issues, the opportunity issues, the role that they could play, particularly when we explain some of the systemic hurdles, like the one I mentioned about postpartum placements. I mean, they fortunately get it. I mean, these healthcare providers are in it for the right reasons, which is they want to help all the people in our state live healthy lives and be empowered to make the choices they want to make when they're ready to make them.
Is it rolling out successfully in other states at this point?
Yes, so Massachusetts has started. They've got a terrific team here, and as I mentioned, Washington and North Carolina. So those are the next 3, and we expect a bunch of other states to follow.
I just find it so interesting that somebody from a business background is focused on this. And I love the way you bring the economics into it, because I think too often we feel like a health argument is going to win the day.
Yeah.
We're good and we should do this. And it really often doesn't carry the day.
I mean, it should carry it more often, but
know.
I think in this case, I mean, we all, I mean, I think people really are shocked when they hear that 50% of pregnancies are not intended,
yeah.
and when they think about what the consequences particularly for the women, so often are. And there are some steps that we can take, and it's obviously totally voluntary. This is for all. We're very clear. This is for all women, and I've been thrilled about how well it's gone.
Yeah, well, that's terrific because states can make a difference, particularly on healthcare issues, because they are personal and you can make change, and that's, in my opinion, where most change happens is at local and state levels.
Oh, for sure.
But the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because when I saw that you were actually the chair of the NGA, I know that every chair gets to have their initiative.
Right.
Right? And so I was looking at the long list of initiatives, and yours was a little different than many. I mean, it was well defined. It had to do with how you basically open up opportunities for work for disabled individuals. Yeah. But it had a more personal undertext to it. If you know, it was unusual compared to others. Why?
Yeah.
I mean, where did that come from?
So I think that two things. First, I had an experience when I was early in my tenure as state treasurer, and I visited one of our employers. It used to be the MBNA. It was a credit card bank that was ultimately taken over by Bank of America. And they were a good employer of people with disabilities. And I went to visit one of their locations in Delaware, and they had a unit that made promotional materials. And I met a guy who was 25 years old. He had Down syndrome. He was making T-shirts, and he was incredibly excited about this job. So I asked him to tell me about the job, and he did. And then I asked him, I said, what did you do before you got this job? And he told me that he had sat at home for 6 years watching TV with his parents. And I thought, oh my gosh, think about the profound improvement in his life, because he had a reason to wake up every day and get dressed and to go to work, to earn a paycheck, to be part of a team, to be part of something that was bigger than himself. And I thought about the improvement in the quality of life of his parents, because they didn't have to sit at home with him all day watching him watch TV and make unhealthy choices about eating snack foods and all these other things. And I thought, if I ever have a chance to work on something at the national level, this is what it would be. And then it turns out, once I was elected governor, I tended to have the same sets of conversations every day. Half of the conversations would be with employers who told me that they had jobs to fill, but they couldn't find people to fill them. And then the other half of set of conversations were with people who said, I just want to work and nobody will give me a shot. Some of those were people who had been incarcerated. Yeah. Some were returning veterans. Some were people whose schooling had just not done well by them. And some were people with disabilities. And so I found myself as governor, really trying to be a broker, bringing these parties together. And I just felt really strongly, when you focus on the ability rather than the disability, it's amazing what we can accomplish together. And so when I became chair of the National Governors Association, I decided on this issue, and it had the great benefit. There's so much division, so much partisan rancor in our country, that this issue, disability, crosses every boundary, including Democrats and Republicans. And so it turns out that some of the governors who most enthusiastically embraced this proposal, we had plenty of Democrats, but Scott Walker in Wisconsin mentioned it in 2 State of the State speeches in a row. Terry Branstad in Iowa before he went off to become the ambassador to China, and so many others. Because we all wanted to be the jobs governor, and what I kept saying was, it's good to be the jobs governor, but let's be the jobs governor for everybody in our state.
And so what did you end up doing to advance that?
So we came up, we spent a lot of time, we had brought a lot of self-advocates in, as well as groups representing various disabilities, and what we found, a number of recommendations that are being implemented across the country. One of them is that very often the state divisions of vocational rehabilitation go to employers and essentially say, can you please do me a favor and find a job for these 5 people who have a disability? That's one approach. A better approach is if the Department of Labor, which is usually where the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation sits, says, you know what, we want to be a partner to our employers and we want to help them find the best possible talent. Now, it turns out that talent comes in many different shapes and sizes, and many people with different kinds of disabilities have enormous talents. And what we're going to do as a State Department of Labor is we're going to partner with these businesses to help them find the right people. And that was a critically important learning. We also found it was really important for businesses to hear from each other. I went to Tom Harkin, our great U.S. Senator from Iowa, who was sort of the #1 guy in the last several decades when it comes to these disability issues. And he was so welcoming and so appreciative that we were doing this work. He invited me to a meeting he was invited to up at a Walgreens facility in Connecticut, where the CEO of Walgreens had invited in CEOs of a bunch of other big companies. And what he said was, we employ people with disabilities not out of charity, but because it's the right thing to do for our shareholders. And that was an incredibly important message for them to hear, and it was a really important message that only a business person could give. We also found it was important that states walk the walk. It's not very effective if you say to employers, business, private sector, you ought to be hiring more people with disabilities. But we as states, we're big employers ourselves, and so we had to really take that first step. And finally, we found it's really important that we prepare our young people with disabilities for an expectation of a lifetime of employment rather than an expectation of a lifetime on public support. And so those were some of the most important findings.
And the main interest that I have in this was just it can be so impactful, not for the individuals or for the companies, but for the families.
It's huge. It is.
I mean, because every parent who has a child with a disability has to struggle to figure out how to manage that life.
And I did not fully appreciate how widespread that is, but I'll tell you, when I decided this was the issue I'd focus on, I had many of my political advisors say, you shouldn't do that, you should do education reform or small business or something, because those are really the big issues that'll get you national attention. I said, no, I'm good. This is what I really think. This is an area where I think we can move the needle. And it turns out, when I went out to talk about it, I would have so many people lined up to tell me their personal stories.
Yeah. And you had a governor do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a terrific honor to you to sort of not fall trap to, I can make a name for myself nationally by doing something, as opposed to doing something for your own state and frankly doing something for the most vulnerable.
Yeah, and we had, Governor Dennis Dugard of South Dakota, for instance, really just embraced this and really became essentially my co-leader, because he was raised by two parents who were deaf. And when he shared that story across the country, it just resonated with so many people.
Well, part of the issue, I think, in the issues that we struggle with at a School of Public Health is not just to recognize the challenges and get health care to respond to it, but how do you develop a social network around that so that individuals can continue to be as much as they can be. Reach their own individual potential. You've thought about the same thing, and this is something that's gotten a lot of emphasis, frankly bipartisan, is to look at criminal justice reform, which is also a big deal, because I don't think people recognize in the United States we're not doing very well in this area. Do you want to explain some of the work that you participated in? Because I know you're still active in this. I was seeing an article that you wrote just maybe 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, actually with Governor Dugard, in fact.
So,
we lock up as a country a higher percentage of our population than most other countries around the world. We're not any safer as a result, and I think it's becoming pretty well accepted that our criminal justice system is pretty much broken. That we lock people up, it doesn't make us safer, they're not getting rehabilitated, and we've got to think differently. And so we brought on, fairly early on in my tenure, the Vera Institute to help us develop what we call, what they call a Justice Reinvestment Initiative, just to be a whole lot smarter about how we do criminal justice reform. So we found, for example, a very significant portion in our women's prison, it was about 40%, in the men's prison just over 20%, of those who are incarcerated had not actually been convicted of a crime. They were there as pre-trial detainees. So they had been arrested,
Can you say that again?
Yeah, in our women's prison at the time, it was about 40%. In the men's prison, just over 20% of the people who were incarcerated. They had been arrested, but they had not been convicted of a crime. And so we looked around the country and said, this doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. And because certainly those who are a threat to the public ought to be locked up. But there are a whole lot of people who are locked up who are not a threat to the public. And it wasn't doing them or the rest of society any good to keep them there. So we did a number of things. So we gave much better guidance to our magistrate judges. Those are the ones who make the initial decision when somebody is first arrested, where to go. I understand. I mean, if you're in their position, the safest thing for you to do is to say, okay, we're going to lock the person up because as long as they're locked up, they're not going to go reoffend, and I'm not going to be held responsible for that. But it's not really. It's not a great way of thinking about the system. So we gave them much better guidance, sort of risk assessments. We borrowed a program from New York, which basically said, identified those who were not a threat to public safety and said, okay, while they're out awaiting trial, let's make sure we connect them to the appropriate services. Let's make sure they show up for all of their appointments. And it's a much better way of going. We did a lot of work on reentry. And so preparing people while they're still in prison to come out. For so many of those people, whether it is that they were receiving substance abuse treatment in prison, but then it wasn't available when they came out, they had no transportation when they got out, they didn't have a place to live, they didn't have job skills. And so historically, all of that had really been the responsibility of our Department of Correction, and we changed that around. I actually put our Secretary of Labor in charge, working with our other cabinet secretaries. Then we had a problem. Delaware is we have some public transportation, but we're not an urban, major market where you have subways and everything. And we had a lot of crimes that even if the crime had nothing to do with driving a car, when you finished serving your sentence, you couldn't get your driver's license. Well, what sense does that make? Because we know that being able to get to work is a pretty good determinant of whether or not you're going to stay out of prison. And so we changed the law so that, and it ended up benefiting, thousands of people. If your crime did not actually involve driving a car, you could get your license back after you had served your time. So simple things like that as well. But, we have a long way to go, in our state. We have a long way to go across the country. But fortunately, the conversation's being had.
And it's interesting the way that it's one of the areas where there is bipartisan consensus that change is absolutely essential.
There is. I mean, so for example, the Koch brothers
my favorites.
Well, but they're doing some really great work in this arena. They really are, and I think it's so easy. What we often do is we caricature people and we put a label on them. But when it comes to criminal justice reform, they invited me a few years ago to New Orleans for a conference to speak on all we were doing in criminal justice reform, and it was really, they really put it on, but the ACLU had a major role. And I think when you can find issues where you get groups like the Koch brothers to work with the ACLU, you know that something's going on. And they really, they put a spotlight on many of the people that they had worked with who were, given a second chance and who were really making the most of it.
Well, let's continue to tout the things where we all work together, because that's actually the way this country is supposed to work. There you go. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but I wanted to not forget to thank you for all the work that you did on clean energy. I know that we've spent some time together at power plants. I always have the most exciting places to go to with governors.
And it was very muddy that day.
I remember that.
It was really muddy.
Horrible, but it was a great facility.
It was a great facility.
But I really appreciate it, because we made, I think, a lot of progress in that area, and it's continuing no matter what's happening. It's moving forward. But mostly I want to find out why, when you finished your second term, you rode off into the sunset on a bicycle.
I did.
Can you explain for the last minute why the heck you would go cross country on a bicycle, and did you have a little dog named Toto in the basket?
It was a bucket list kind of thing for me, and I started in Oregon, did my back wheel in the Pacific, and 50 days later, I did my front wheel in the Atlantic off the coast of Rehoboth Beach, and it was a great experience that I would absolutely never do again.
So that isn't what you would recommend that people do when they leave office.
I would. I'm really glad I did it, but yeah.
So tell me, after completing that, what excites you now? What are the things you really want to do?
I think being the charter member of the Gina McCarthy for President Club is pretty exciting.
I will keep you very, very busy.
I think it's very
one
exciting.
vote at a time.
No, it's great. I mean, I'm working on a bunch of really interesting issues, and it's. I mean, you know, I can't remember who said the highest title in our country is head of citizen. I love being governor, but it's great being a former governor as well, and I really enjoy, you know, so many of the opportunities I'm working on.
Terrific. Well, let me thank you for coming here to the School of Public Health, and it's exciting to know that we have business people who can make the transition and really make a difference in the world. And you did a wonderful job in Delaware. I think we can all tell from the conversation we've had that you also happen to be a very caring human being, and I hope you stay in the game. And we'll all continue to work together, and hopefully we'll get some more bipartisan efforts on things that matter to all of us. So
thanks.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for all you did too.
Thank you. Thank you very much.